while this country is not perfect, it is our last best hope for freedom in the world. And so I think that's where you see that element of federalism, state governments pushing back and saying, hey, DC has gotten out of control, get out of here, let us manage our own lives. And we start to see that pushback. It starts at a local level, it starts bit by bit. But really, that's where I hope that hopefully it doesn't melt down into a conflict, because at the end of the day, while our institutions aren't perfect, it's created a lot of opportunity for us.
America is divided because our powerful federal government pits red states against blue. We need to return power to the states and to the people by decentralizing. If that fails, we must be prepared for a peaceful national divorce or face a destructive civil war. Welcome to War, Divorce, or Federalism. America at a crossroads.
Today on War, Divorce, or Federalism, we welcome Thomas Savidge, Research Fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research. An expert in public finance, intergovernmental relations, and fiscal reform, Savidge has sounded the alarm on the collapse of true fiscal federalism in America. He argues that Washington's sprawling power through grants, mandates, and debt is creating a codependent relationship between state policymakers and DC, ignoring the people they are supposed to serve. And so we therefore dig into the question, can smarter fiscal policy restore autonomy to the states, or is the American experiment already too centralized to save? Thomas, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Rick.
Well, you are going to be a fountain of information. There are so many questions that I have. The podcast starts with the premise that we are very polarized in America because we are so tied to a strong centralized government with a top-down, one-size-fits-all policy, whether it is in the culture war or specifically today, whether it is with fiscal policy and debt. And the idea is that if we can decentralize, we can maybe cool the temperature, we can become much less polarized and more civilized. The question, though, is how can we do that? And my first question to you is, do you see that the fiscal policies that we have had in Washington, D.C. for the last decades have helped to create this situation of a very centralized, powerful government in DC, causing us to be so polarized?
Well, yeah, Rick, absolutely. It's funny because there's actually a great book on this called Purchasing Submission by a Columbia law professor named Philip Hamburger. And he talks about how many of these grants, that end up going to the states, of course, the largest of that being Medicaid, because Medicaid is a joint federal and state funded program. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But generally, when the federal government is passing on grants to the states, whether it be for healthcare spending like Medicaid, infrastructure spending, education, you name it, those grants always come with strings attached. And the unique thing that Hamburger talks about is that quite often, those terms and conditions that get baked into these federal grants end up giving the federal government greater control over the states and state and local affairs than they ever could have dreamed of having if they had just tried to explicitly pass a law through Congress. And of course, their excuse is, well, nobody made them take the money. We offered it, and that's what's baked into the terms and conditions. And if states don't like it, they can give it up. But unfortunately, with these grants comes a lot of pressure, both at the state level from both people in Washington and many interest groups at the state level that want to see the states take on federal grants because it allows them to increase spending.
I was a freshman legislator in 2013 and got a study passed to look at the amount of money we were getting from the federal government, in what programs, what strings were attached, and the cost of those strings attached. Now, I thought it was going to be a brilliant study that was going to shine light on everything. And the problem is that the agencies, of course, drag their feet. They don't want, well-intentioned legislators to get their fingers in there and possibly stop the money supply. So I think that people are aware, for the most part, that states do get a tremendous amount of money from the federal government. I don't know how much the average person realizes how those strings are attached and how DC affects policy through that grant giving. What are a few of the examples that you might see beyond Medicaid?
That's a great question. I think some things, as far as one that pops into my head, is law enforcement spending. Is that if state and local law enforcement cooperate with federal law enforcement on certain operations, there's a stipulation that allows any assets seized during a federal law enforcement operation, a certain percentage of that goes to the state and local law enforcement offices. And I think there's much debate over whether that should be happening, could it be happening, but at the end of the day, you see that tie of influence. All of a sudden, when these local offices are depending upon, say, a certain portion of those assets seized, they're going to follow federal law enforcement policy. They're going to start listening to the people who are paying, to the people who are in Washington who are directing these operations, and they're turning away from the communities that they're expected to serve. And it's basically that old saying, "He who pays the piper calls the tune." And I think that's it's great that you did that study, and we have some data available. And there's actually a data set that comes out every year from the National Association of State Budget Officers that breaks down state expenditures by type and where the funding comes from. And on average, just this past year, in fiscal year 2024, about 35% of total state expenditures, that's capital inclusive, so for capital projects as well, about 35% of those expenditures were funded by federal transfers. And that's just for the average state. You get states that go up to Louisiana, which is the most dependent on federal transfers. Half of its expenditures come from some sort of federal grants. And that means a huge amount of influence from the folks in Washington on that state.
Interesting. I want to get a little bit more into the grants and what states can do and so forth, but a little bit bigger picture, a little more 30,000 foot view. To what degree do you think state sovereignty exists at all with this scheme of the money being funneled through DC, granted back to the states with all these strings attached?
Well, I think there is some good news there. The state sovereignty is a hardy weed, and that we're not totally subservient to the folks in Washington. And in fact, before coming to AIER, I worked at the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, and I really got to meet a lot of folks across the states, a lot of state legislators who, interestingly, many are part-time. So 9 months out of the year, they have to be regular people. They have to live and work in the communities that they're serving. And there's still some of that. There's still people out there, especially in the heartland, who want to do right by the citizens that they're serving. There's still a lot of state autonomy, particularly with you see it in tax and fiscal policy as well, especially recently over the past couple of years with the flat tax revolution, where now we have almost half of the states having a flat income tax, and numerous states have transitioned from a graduated income tax system to a flat tax system. And so they're really, while of course there's a lot to be concerned about, states still do have some autonomy. And even after coming out from under from the pandemic, states are starting to get control back by enabling them to do Medicaid and audit enrollments. And a lot of the stipulations that got tied to many of these huge stimulus packages over the past couple of years are expiring, and states are getting some control back. So the cause is not totally lost there, and state sovereignty to some extent is still there, but of course there is that looming federal presence in the background.
In trying to regain state sovereignty, what portion could we ever hope for to come from DC in sort of acquiescing and saying we are going to loosen up this grip, this method of control we have over the states, versus the percentage that must come from the states taking control themselves?
That's a great question, Rick. I think as far as DC, it might actually come out of necessity rather than a willingness to acquiesce back to the states. And really, it's as we're seeing those budget strains come at the federal level, before policymakers in DC dare touch programs like Social Security or Medicare, which will cause huge political blowback if they decide to cut to that, they're going to adjust funding to the states. And instead of outright cuts, they're just going to adjust the matching rates. And they're going to say, okay, the states have to pick up a little bit more of the tab, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare or infrastructure. They'll say, okay, states, we're we're going to adjust our portion of what we're paying, and you guys have to pick up the tab, because it leaves the difficult decisions to the state policymakers, and the folks in DC, for better or worse, wash their hands of that difficult choice. And I think at the state level, there's a lot more hope there. And I think a perfect example of this is actually out in Utah. In the wake of the Great Recession, several groups of public accountants came together, and they pushed for a financial ready Utah package of bills. And that actually put in a lot of really good guardrails against the influence of federal funding in Utah, where the legislature required that if a state agency wanted to receive a federal grant, they had to get approval from the legislature in the first place. Now, of course, that didn't stop all federal grants from coming in, but it shined a lot of light there. And then on top of that, all state agencies are required to have an emergency plan in place in case of anywhere between, I believe it's 5 to 25% immediate cut in funding, which basically simulates an overnight loss of their federal grants. So if overnight the federal government just decides to turn off the spigot, they have to be able to simulate that, be prepared for that, and prioritize those budgets and properly prioritize their own spending to be able to do without those federal grants. And I'm even seeing it across the states here, states that are especially dependent, like here in Indiana, actually, where I live. Many folks in the state budget agency are really concerned about this. And so they're starting to go through and look and using software to determine where government federal grants are going, to seeing if two agencies are double dipping in the same federal programs, and trying to at least first make sense of where all this federal money is going and where it's coming from, what federal programs, and trying to streamline that as well to really loosen state dependence on DC.
When you bring up the Medicaid thing about the federal government pulling back on matching rates, I see where you're going, where in a sense, if you're getting less as a state from the federal government, then it hurts less if you are not going to comply and forego that money that would be coming to you. But I see a little bit of a counterplay as well, where if you're going to provide the same service with Medicaid, the same reimbursement rates and so forth, and you're getting less from the federal government, that means you're taking more from your own state reserves or taxing your people more. In theory, then you more desperately need the money coming from the federal government. I think tell me your thoughts. It's almost like you'd have to be prepared as a state legislature, in knowing how you're going to adapt to the less reimbursement from the federal government. And perhaps the only way is what, decreasing the funding to the providers?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think states, they're going to be stuck with some really difficult choices there. They're either, like you said, raise taxes or cut spending across the board in those programs, or take spending, divert it from other programs. So seeing budget cuts elsewhere. The provider taxes are a really sneaky thing there, which is something that's been the subject of discussion with Medicaid reform, because these provider taxes are actually states actually use these as a means of increasing the federal matching rate for Medicaid. And basically what that does, so for the folks out there and for the folks out there in radio land, Medicaid is a joint federal and state funded program. The federal government pays a portion of Medicaid for each state. In traditional Medicaid, which is, for single mothers, for the working poor, and they have to meet a certain income threshold to get into traditional Medicaid. The federal government pays what's called a federal medical assistance percentage, or an FMAP, where it pays there's at least 50%, which if the state spends that, the federal government has to contribute at least 50% of that percentage to Medicaid funding. Now, when Obamacare expanded Medicaid, the federal government wanted to entice states to expand Medicaid. So they said, the first 3 years of the program, we are going to pay 100% of the state matching rate. Like, the federal government's going to pick up the tab for the states. And then it ratcheted down to 90-10, and they promised, oh, don't worry, it'll just be 90-10 from here on out, from here to eternity. But of course, as the saying goes, ever is a long time. And as those budget strains in DC worsen, as those screws tighten, I don't doubt that expansion group, it's going to get, that matching rate is going to go down to 80-20, 75-25, maybe even to a point where states that have expanded Medicaid are now going to be paying for the lion's share of this expansion group, because that expanded Medicaid to a large number of working age adults, a lot of what get classified as able-bodied adults without dependents, young workers who could otherwise be getting health insurance through an employer. And unfortunately, that's also, that's also focused on, that's also created a lot of strain on Medicaid programs. It means that states emphasize Medicaid spending on that expansion group because they get a higher matching rate. And that comes to the detriment of the poorest Americans who are on Medicaid. And you hear stories about how, folks that get grouped into this traditional Medicaid group lose access to services because states are no longer paying attention, because that's where they're getting the sweeter deal at the expansion group. But again, back to those provider taxes. Basically, what the state does is they'll tax a healthcare provider at a certain rate, and then the taxes collected get counted as Medicaid spending. And so that Medicaid spending increase from those taxes on the healthcare provider get counted as a spending increase in the federal matching rate. And so when the federal government increases their spending on the state's portion of Medicaid, that money goes to the state, and the state kicks it back to the healthcare provider. So it's a tax and then a lot of kickback, even to those specific healthcare providers. So many healthcare providers are happy to go along with these quote unquote provider taxes because it increases their spending. The state government gets an increased share from the federal government, and it creates a lot of unsustainable spending growth across the program and additional budget stress that eventually is going to roll downhill onto the states. And the states are going to be left scrambling with having to fund these massive programs out of their own coffers.
Yeah, Medicaid is a huge one. And with that Medicaid expansion, just like you said, the federal government effectively acted like a drug dealer, saying, here, take this. It's no cost to you. Just enjoy it. And then once they're hooked, because of course, once you start the program, you're never going to take it away. And once you're hooked, now you got to start paying for it, and you're going to keep paying for it. And in this case, it's going to be more and more and more. It's, politicians really are focused on immediate gratification. That free money that comes in now, I don't think generally elected officials worry about what's down the road, because who knows, maybe they're not even going to be in office at that time. Okay, so what can states do aside from just saying we don't want the money? And there might be some programs, maybe education for one, where it's really not a tremendous amount of money. And perhaps if they just had the gumption, they could forego that money from the federal government and the strings attached and be in charge of their own education policy or whatever other area it might be. Is that really the primary thing to say, I'm not taking the money and I'm not following those strings attached?
I think that's a point to look at the Utah program that I mentioned earlier as well, Rick, where it's like you just look under the hood, you see where the federal money is going. And, for example, education, you look at that and you ask yourself, state legislators will ask themselves, well, where is this money going? What purpose is it serving? Or would we be better just handling these things ourselves, or even devolving it to the local governments there and giving greater local control? And are there any sort of benefits outweighing the costs of greater federal control and greater dependence on these programs? And I think that, I'm really glad you brought up that point just a second ago there about, elected official incentives, right? Because of course, the famous Thomas Sowell quote, politicians, their two goals are to get elected, get reelected, and whatever priority number 3 is far behind the first two. And, the thing is that's the danger of the federal grants, where state leaders will see these federal grants, like you said, as quote unquote a free lunch, where they'll see that and say, well, we have the ability to increase spending and have the cost of that spending be paid for by taxpayers in other states. So they're able to keep their taxpayers' bills relatively low while enjoying all of this spending. But like you said, it's easy to get, once you're on, you're hooked. But I going back to what you had asked there, it really is that Utah model where it, maybe it's not everyone, but it takes a couple of dedicated individuals to really go through and examine the fine print there and ask the really tough questions. Is this serving any kind of purpose? Or is it just, money that we don't have to take from our citizens, and we're, basically giving ourselves up to greater federal control? And I think, it's really something there where it takes a lot of both folks in the government and watchdogs outside of the government saying, hey, where is this money going to? What purpose is it serving? And do we really need this kind of thing or this kind of program in our community? And I think that's where it really starts. And, that's how you get back to the heart of federalism, where it's the ability not just to have one central command and control from DC, it's the ability to create and shape the communities that you best see fit. And it gets down to that most local level, that it's the folks deciding for themselves. And I think if there is going to be real solutions to this problem, it is going to come from the states, and the states will then nudge DC to acquiesce a little bit.
People always say, follow the money trail. If we were able to get a handle on this sort of, we'll say, fiscal federalism, if the states were able to be more in charge and control of the money, do you think that would solve the issue of this hyper-polarized environment that we're in nationally, or do you think it's just a piece of the pie?
Oh, I think there is a piece of the pie. It is a piece of the pie there. And it is, I think it would do a lot. It would do a lot to fix a lot of the polarization problems. Unfortunately, what we're seeing now is, especially in the age of the internet, some of the loudest voices are really the smaller groups that have really strong opinions about one issue or another. But I'm not sure how much that actually reflects the average American. But I think restoring that federalism, restoring the competition among the states, where instead of relying on federal transfers to shape policies and to fund certain programs, states have to become more competitive with one another, that sort of healthy competition, where they have to create the best policies that, enable people to want to live, work, and raise their families in their state. And you see that a bit with net domestic migration. It's like you see where people are voting with their feet and with their money. People are fleeing these massive regulatory states like New York, California, and they're going to states that are generally freer. You saw that a lot in 2020, and whether that's IRS data or even, moving company data such as U-Haul and United Vans, like people vote with their feet. They want to go to places that have relatively low cost of living, relatively low tax burdens, and they want to be able to, they really want to be able to see where they are free to build and live their own lives. And so I think loosening that will really force states to engage in that kind of healthy competition again. And it could turn down the temperature on a lot of federal policies as well, because without the federal government being entrenched in so many different areas, reducing not only, of course, as my colleague Dave Hebert likes to say, don't just starve the beast of revenue, we got to starve the beast of responsibilities as well. By doing that, the temperature comes down and the stakes get much lower, because it's not just a battle over one policy that's set for the entire nation. It's the states and localities being able to set these policies. And if you don't like what one particular town or state is doing, you could always pick up and move to somewhere else. And states and local governments will listen and respond to that.
Last week I had an expert on the podcast here about nullification. And it just occurred to me, I'd love to get both of you on a show to discuss this question. That is, would nullification, so the states can nullify in the sense of, say, marijuana has been done so often. More recently, it has to do with immigration, sanctuary cities or states, and somewhat recently, the Second Amendment, sanctuary states. How beneficial to gaining state sovereignty, fiscal federalism, do you think a nullification of federal income tax laws would be, in the sense that if a state declares, listen, if our people aren't going to send in income tax, if they're going to keep it in state, we aren't going to have local and state officials enforce the IRS laws. Do you think that has any legs at all?
I think they could. I think some people could really scare some folks at the IRS, but I'm not sure about the political legs because, again, as you said, we got to follow the money there. If they don't want to send federal income taxes into Washington, Washington will turn around and say, "Well, we'd be happy to pause any sort of grants going to you guys as well." And there's actually a really interesting story about this in the Great Depression, where the state of Arkansas, which was the last state to default on its debts, they saw the automobile rising. They said, let's issue a ton of debt to build highways and infrastructures, and it'll bring in so much. We don't have the money to pay the debt right now, but their thought was, oh, well, the business that it'll bring in will be able to pay the debt, as it comes due. So we won't need to worry. Then, of course, you get stuck in the Depression. Arkansas is unable to pay these bonds, and they end up defaulting on the debt. And now you have a lot of bond investors, especially bond investors in New York, who are saying, all right, you guys need to pay up. We loaned you this money. You promised this. The state of Arkansas attempted to declare sovereign immunity and said, we're not going to pay it back. We're declaring sovereign immunity. And so what did the bondholders end up doing? They went to their friends in Washington. And many of these New Deal programs popping up, the federal government ended up saying, listen, we're going to, whether it's the National Recovery Act, all of these federal grants that had been promised to Arkansas, the federal government turned around and said, listen, if you guys don't come to the negotiating table, we will withhold all federal grants to the state of Arkansas until you do. And that brought them to the negotiating table. It forced Arkansas's hand, and the bond investors, especially those that had complained to their friends in D.C., were pretty much made whole. And it took Arkansas basically until it took them 30 years. So they had reached above junk and a decent credit rating in the 1960s. So that was 30 years from when they defaulted until they, you consider them fully back on track. And so I think they could, maybe make some waves there, but at the end of the day, it comes back to he who pays the piper calls the tune. And right now, the federal government has enough sway in state finances that they could bring anybody to the negotiating table. And so I would say before attempting to change the federal income tax like that and challenge that, states need to look in their own books. They need to look in their own, sort of look at under the hood of what's going on in their state government and decrease the dependence on those federal transfers.
Brought up debt. What do you think? This $35 trillion debt that the federal government has, do you see that? What impact do you see that having on this idea of fiscal federalism, of state sovereignty, at least on a fiscal level?
Well, I see that as it's the screws are tightening in Washington. They're likely to try to finance this through a combination of tax hikes and printing money, where they will, there's always the temptation of when you have a large stock of dollar-denominated debt, there's this huge temptation to pay it off quickly with surprise inflation. And so that'll end up hurting, the average American, because they'll end up seeing higher cost of living, higher taxes, and of course, diminishing quality of government services, which of course, the government can't do any. There are a few things the government can do better than the private sector, and what they are doing, which we're probably not happy with, it's going to end up, the quality of that is going to get even worse, which is going to be more frustrating for us. And so I guess I really see it as that level of debt really pushing on the federal government to cut funding for the states, and those cuts will come in matching rate adjustments, or they might even pull grants altogether for certain projects. And then, of course, that will cause a lot of strain at the states. If you and the viewers out there recall the Eurozone crisis in the wake of the Great Recession, all of those states defaulting on the debts, I think if you're going to see that in the United States, it's going to happen among state governments, not the national government. Because on one end, like I had mentioned before, you have states that are so dependent on federal transfers, but at the same time, many states have been spending irresponsibly themselves, whether it's in their own hard debt or in unfunded liabilities, where they have made promises to public employees to pay out pension promises, retire other benefits as well. And they've made these promises and they haven't properly funded those promises. And so between those two things, those are really going to be the state governments, many of them, particularly places like Illinois, New Jersey, New York, California. They are really going to be stuck between a rock and a hard place, dealing with federal cuts as well as the debt that they've accumulated, and you're going to see budget crises across the states.
I've talked about how I think that we are in a position where there would be a single inciting event, and perhaps a combination, that would trigger a crisis in the U.S. and could lead to a national divorce or multiple secessions, Colexit, Texit, things like that. One of them might be, say, another pandemic of some sort, something with AI. But one of them is, at least in my mind, the idea that we could go into a period of hyperinflation if the dollar loses its global reserve status, if the BRICS nations are successful in doing whatever they're trying to do. So can you talk just a little bit about that? Is it likely that we could lose that kind of status? And if that happens, is it likely we would go into hyperinflation? And if that happens, how is that going to affect this whole idea of federalism?
Well, those are great questions, Rick. And, those are actually, my colleague Peter Ohl has covered that a lot. Of course, I think there's mixed threats, but really, I think the crux of Pete's work there, Peter Ohl has done a lot of awesome stuff on de-dollarization, is that the biggest threat to the US dollar's status as a reserve currency is right here at home. It's what we're doing. It's the reckless fiscal policy. It's the blurring of the lines between fiscal and monetary policy, where both Congress and the executive branch, regardless of what party is in power, both branches have really leaned on the Federal Reserve to be more accommodative of their political goals. Where if you're going to have a central bank, which I'm not crazy about, but if there is a central bank, it should just focus on monetary stability. The Fed has strayed from that mission, both from external pressure and then, of course, internal pressure, where they embrace mission creep. They want to be the ones that save the day. And as the saying goes, no government agency, whether it's a central bank or otherwise, is going to be content with just being a bureau of weights and measures. So we are seeing that, real threat. It's, of course, it is difficult. This is another great point that Pete points out, is it's really difficult to pin down an exact date of when this could happen. A lot of people have squandered a lot of credibility saying it's going to happen on X date, and then that day comes and goes and doomsday doesn't come. But it's important to emphasize what that would look like. It's not about picking a certain date and saying, okay, we have until X date to get things right. But it's sort of this slow burn, this slow creep that we're, in some states, we're starting to see it where the debt is swallowing up more and more of taxpayer dollars. Extreme example is the city of Chicago, where property tax rates, which have gone up again, Chicago now has some of the highest property taxes in the country. All property tax revenue is going towards debt service. That's it. And so folks in Chicago are, paying an arm and a leg for property taxes. And they're like, well, what do we have to show for it?
That's crazy.
But I think then whether it leads to a national divorce or some kind of conflict, I certainly hope not. Again, and that's where I see, state leaders really emerging, because it's, while this country is not perfect, it is our last best hope for freedom in the world. And so I think that's where you see that element of federalism, state governments, pushing back and saying, hey, DC has gotten out of control, get out of here. Let us manage our own lives. And we start to see that pushback. It starts at a local level. It starts bit by bit. But really, that's where I hope that hopefully it doesn't melt down into a conflict or something, because at the end of the day, while our institutions aren't perfect, it's created a lot of opportunity for us. And as you've seen throughout history, it's much easier to tear things down than it is to build them back up. Even when you do have a blueprint for freedom and the institutions that are conducive to human flourishing, it's much harder to build those back up. So hopefully, I think I believe there are still off-ramps before we get to that crisis, but it's going to take some courage and some gumption, as you mentioned, to access those off-ramps.
As states start to look into this fiscal federalism more seriously as they start to say, we're not going to, well, if they look under the hood more carefully, as you've said, if they don't take money because of the strings that are attached, do you see that as a cooling effect to this heated rhetoric of national divorce, or do you think that starts the domino, like, hey, we're actually fine by not taking this federal money and acquiescing to these federal demands? Let's just keep the ball rolling, and it actually pushes into more of a national divorce.
That's a really interesting question, Rick. And, I guess I've always seen it as the former because it allows these states to have more sovereignty, but with, sort of the benefits of being a part of a larger United States where you get those national security benefits, which, of course, the national security apparatus is far from perfect. And we could spend hours talking about all the stuff that they're messing up on. But I guess this is where, it's interesting. The interesting subject of your podcast, I think this is where I lean a bit more towards federalism rather than war or divorce, because I worry that in the case of a national divorce, you may see other nations that, of course, do not embrace freedom and have a chip on their shoulder about, the things the United States has done. In many cases, the United States have done wrongly abroad with that interventionism, that they want to strike back at us. They want to see us collapse, of course. And if they could do that without us firing a shot, they'd be more than happy to help out with that. And that's where it's, I think, having that healthy tug of war between the states and DC. So maybe a little bit of that nullification element. I'm hoping that, but I think that's a good question where states start seeing, okay, we don't need this federal money. Let's see how much we can do without Washington. I think, that is potential, but of course, there are of course, like as Thomas Sowell says, no solutions, only trade-offs. If they totally leave the United States, there are going to be some serious trade-offs they'll have to consider, and when they do, they'll have to really look and weigh at those options.
Texit and Collexit folks both have told me that their states are net providers of income to the federal government, not net takers. And as such, they feel much more comfortable leaving on a financial level. We've talked about how the federal government would respond. A lot of people would say militarily. I kind of don't think so, but I'm thinking that they may respond in some manner, again, with dollars. What do you think the federal government has in its quiver of tools to try and keep states in line if they're starting to rattle their sabers about leaving the union?
I think you hit the nail on the head there with, the primary thing is, of course, dollars. And it goes back to that Arkansas story during the Great Depression. The states will say, we're happy to withhold anything. And, while it's a, Texit or Collexit, every state has billions of dollars in hard debt, bonded obligations. And they have to answer, even if it's not directly to the federal government, they have to answer to those private bond investors. And what it does to their ability to take on money, which of course many states right now will take on. They act like they have an Amex black card with no credit limit, and they could perpetually issue debt, which of course is the wrong perspective. And at the end of the day, if states are considering, if even communities are considering, infrastructure projects, they might not be able to pay for everything up front. And so that will require some access to credit there. And, I think the federal government, like you said, of course, it's that money. And they will also happily remind them that, if you're not going to be a part of the United States, you will lose access to that preferential credit treatment, and your credit ratings, may go off the deep end because you're now this new independent country. And I think, those will be two really powerful tools that the federal government will have at its hands to kind of keep everything together. Although it's interesting as far as secession, one secessionary idea that I've been really interested in is parts of Northern California looking to break away from Sacramento and forming their own states. Like I don't know a lot about it, but I think, from what I've heard, a lot of folks are just really tired of, Southern California kind of ruling the roost with the states, and they want to kind of go their own way. And they don't want to, they want to be able to determine the institutions for themselves. And they're sick of being outweighed by those who advocate for interventionism in Sacramento and breaking away, local communities breaking away from the states.
Yeah, so interesting. One of the leaders of Calexit, so they clearly want to have the ability to break from the United States, has said that they would not allow Jefferson or those northern counties to break from the then seceded state of California. So I found that interesting.
That's really funny. Secession for me, but not for thee.
Yeah, exactly. So are you aware of anything where the federal government is currently coercing individual states to keep them in line because they have been non-compliant or intending to be non-compliant? Anything happening now?
As far as enforcement, I haven't seen anything, and I think this is really interesting where even for something extreme, like say the CARES Act, which was the pandemic stimulus package in 2020, the Treasury set out these guidelines saying, you can't use this to fund tax cuts, which of course the states pushed back on legally. And they also stipulated that states could not use this money to fund public pension systems. And yet there was this interesting AEI paper that found many states, especially some of the worst states with public pension debt, such as Illinois, ended up doing just that. And maybe there's a stern wag of the finger, but I haven't really seen a lot of enforcement there. I think one interesting aspect that we might see is looking at the case of Puerto Rico's debt and default and credit and bankruptcy proceedings, where you have this oversight board managing the debt of the Commonwealth. And I think one thing that is really interesting in seeing in Puerto Rico is that when it initially came about in 2016 and the case was brought before the Supreme Court, the White House had sent a strong recommendation to the Supreme Court to hear this case because it could be used as legal precedent for state government defaults. Because as of right now, in the U.S. Bankruptcy Code, there is no chapter for a state government default. So local governments, like say Detroit or San Bernardino, can go through bankruptcy. State component units, which are entities that. And they're in this strange legal gray area where the states say they're legally separate, such as mass transit authorities, state universities, economic development boards, utilities. Those entities can access the U.S. Bankruptcy Code, but whether or not they're actually legally separate and whether or not the state is actually responsible for them, not sure how that would hold up in court, but I'm not a lawyer. But I think really looking at Puerto Rico and seeing how that gets managed, that would be really an interesting, that'd be a case. But as far as states wholesale, I haven't really seen a lot. And I guess the closest thing I could say to that is the recent federal crackdown on universities, with the Trump administration going after places like Harvard and Columbia, which have been a hotbed of protest, which regardless of how viewers view that situation, I think it's a classic lesson in the government that is big enough to give you everything is big enough to take everything away. And regardless of how viewers might feel about those issues, these universities have become incredibly dependent on federal grants and transfers and these sorts of things. And, they couldn't bank on administrations and, folks in Washington just kind of giving them a pass for whatever. As soon as these universities do something that the folks in Washington don't like, they are going to hang those strings attached over them like the sword of Damocles. And they're going to say, remember where this money comes from. Remember, we have a huge stake in where this money comes from. And as quickly as we gave it to you, we're happy to pull it away. So it's interesting where it seems like a lot of states are getting away with misusing funds. There is still very much that ever-present threat of a rug pull as well. I haven't seen it as broadly. It hasn't been as advertised, and some states are getting away with some things. But I think it'll be interesting to see over the next couple of years, Rick.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think if we are federally going to try and get our house in order financially, I think we're going to see a lot of those potential rug pulls, because there's such a limited degree to which the federal government can get their fiscal house in order. They're going to have to pull away what we have been accustomed to, whether it's these institutions of higher education or whether it's the states. That's the rug pull, I think, is right on. Is there a point in which fiscal centralization becomes tyranny to the point that, like Jefferson or our founding fathers would say, okay, this is the time to resist. This is tyranny. Would it be a CBDC? Is it something else? Does that time ever potentially come?
Well, I think we are already seeing it in so many ways with these pervasive federal programs. And, it's great that Hamburger mentions this in his book, that it's, even if states are voluntarily waiving a lot of their own sovereignty, and even if they're giving it up, that doesn't give the federal government a legal right to do so. And I think it is worth pushing back on, whether that be through raising awareness, even if it's something as even though a lawsuit is not as exciting as, say, a Boston Tea Party, a lawsuit can really cause a lot of ripples and could really make a lot of positive changes. But I think we are seeing a lot of that control, even if it's sort of that creeping despotism. Even something something like, say, Medicare, which of course is not going to the states. It's funding that will go, say, directly to the hospital. Medicare funding dictates even the daily schedule of a staff at a hospital. Like when I was in undergrad, I was dating a girl who was going for her nursing certification, and she told me this amazing story where any sort of Medicare patient, they had to be constantly attentive to. The Medicare patient was not allowed to get out of bed by themselves, because if that patient happened to fall, Medicaid would not cover them and the hospital would have to eat the cost. And so it dictated the routines of the entire staff on that floor to ensuring that those dollars kept flowing in. And it's even something as, they have to go in and check on them. If this person needs to use the restroom, they have to go and, they have to go in and help them out of bed, help them, do their thing and get back into bed. And it's dictating the daily routines of this staff. And of course, doing that comes at the cost of the next highest value of their time. They could, you're dictating even the daily minutia, the daily routines, those everyday tasks that somebody, even who is, not a full-blown registered nurse, but a certified nursing assistant, that is really just, it's crazy to see how pervasive that is, because they're saying you have to behave in such a way that the federal dollars, those taxpayer dollars, keep flowing in. And it's really insane to see, which of course, healthcare, while many people say it's a market-driven system, it's anything but that. And even the parts of healthcare that are quote unquote private, those standards, those regulations are all set by Medicare and Medicaid, and and of course the Obamacare expansion as well. That bleeds so much into it's really something to see how it's been this sort of slow creep. I think we are seeing it in a lot of aspects, but of course, like I said, that freedom and competition and federalism are hardy weeds. They're like, it's not the peonies in a vase that have to be kept fragile. It's the dandelion growing between the blocks of concrete. Even if no matter how many times you pluck it out or you spray it with whatever, it's still popping up. They're still popping up. And that's, I think, where even looking at and awareness, of course, is the first thing, and understanding how so many of these programs impact our everyday lives. And I think we are seeing elements of tyranny almost, because, and if you look at the Federal Code of Regulations too, that really is it's insane to see how basically everything under the sun gets covered by a federal regulation. And so raising that awareness, pushing back again isn't, it might not always be the Battle of Lexington and Concord, that kind of pushback. Sometimes a pushback is a citizen awareness campaign. It's, even if it's something as a lawsuit, which of course, it doesn't sound as exciting as, hearing the stories of the founding generation there fighting British tyranny. But, don't discount that stuff. Really it is saying, is just kind of waking up and saying, and, getting people aware of, how pervasive this stuff is, and letting them push back with their voice, vote with their feet. And they get up and leave and move to the most free states, and other states have to say, oh, well, what are they doing right that they're attracting families and businesses? We should try to replicate that. Or even, of course, voting with their dollars. And I think there's I think a couple of foundations, the Institute for Justice and the Pacific Legal Foundation specifically, as far as when we talk about lawsuits, they really do yeoman's work, sticking it to the man, sticking it to the government, suing the government over, in order to protect property rights, in order to push back against these pervasive federal regulations. So yes, I'd say there's a lot of tyranny everywhere, but there's also a lot of hope. Federalism, freedom, it's a hardy weed. Competition's a hardy weed, and you can't just stamp that out, even with an uncountable number of federal programs and regulations.
I do like the optimism. I tend to be a little pessimistic on this program, so it's nice to have you interject that. Tom, I'd like to just go to a quick round, few questions we call rapid fire, 30-second or less answers. Sure. Should states just reject federal grants altogether, or should they do more of the looking under the hood approach?
I'd say look under the hood, because that way, at the end of the day, of course, state elected officials, local elected officials have to face the communities they're serving. And if they're just rejecting wholesale, there may be some political backlash, and their voters might replace them with other people who just take the federal grants back. So look under the hood. Look at what's going on and be prepared to answer to your constituents about why it's a good idea to pull away from these federal programs and how just nasty and undermining they are.
A balanced budget amendment. Is that amazing reform, or is it just window dressing?
I would say, the best way to think of a balanced budget amendment is it's not a silver bullet. It's an arrow in the quiver. Balanced budget amendment is good. It'll help keep states fiscally responsible, but it's not a cure-all. If you're only focusing on balanced budget amendments and not looking at how government officials prioritize spending, so in example, focusing on the core functions of government as opposed to serving, say, concentrated interests, or even focusing on things like regulatory reform, that's all to your detriment. Don't look at a balanced budget amendment as something that's going to fix everything. And once we get it, it's going to be all's well that ends well. It's one of the many tools in your toolkit to increasing freedom. It's good, but it can't do everything.
Gotcha. Which of these is the biggest enemy of decentralization? Congress, the Fed, or the regulatory state?
Oh, goodness. That's a tough one. Because I could see arguments for all three, but I think really, I would say it's a combination of Congress and the regulatory state, because Congress will approve those spending grants. Of course, Congress is the power of the purse, but then it's the regulatory state. Think of those executive agencies that set the terms and conditions of the funding. So they kind of go hand in hand there. I would say really it's those two that are the villains in our story.
Last question. Is there a scenario in which the hardy weed of federalism dies and national divorce or civil war is inevitable?
I certainly hope not. But I think, too, if you look at stories from around the world, even under the worst despotisms, there's still hope. Even in the Soviet Union, there were still black markets for American music. There was still, despite their attempts at snuffing out any sense of free enterprise and free exchange, they couldn't do it. The worst of the worst possible dictatorships imaginable were not able to do it. And even with supercomputers and AI and things like that, there's still that hardy weed is still going to pop up between the cracks of cement. And that's, I might sound like overly optimistic or naive, but I think, there really is no situation where that hardy weed still doesn't pop through. But I certainly hope things do not boil over into real conflict there.
All right. Tom Savidge from the American Institute for Economic Research, thank you so much for being with us. If you can let our viewers know where they can find you and the Institute.
Certainly. So you could visit the American Institute for Economic Research, AIER's website. You could also visit our new website, thedailyeconomy.org, and subscribe there, where we give our updates on our daily blog posts, white papers, and keep track of there. You could also find me on x.com at Thomas_Savidge. That's IDGE. So no relation to the Macho Man.
All right. Thomas, thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Rick.
Okay. All right. Well.